Okay, the recording has begun. Go ahead and take it away, folks.
All right, thanks very much, Dan, and thanks to everyone else to the team getting this set up. My name is David Grogan. I'm a PhD student in anthropology. Specifically, I'm an archaeologist at the University of Notre Dame. I'm joined by two other colleagues here from the University of Notre Dame, fellow graduate students, Cece Chisdock and Keri Porter, who are both bioarchaeologists. And Cece is actually joining us from Jordan right now, where she's conducting some field work. In my offline world, my research project actually focuses on exchange systems of early medieval Irish glass. So this is a little bit of a departure from my primary dissertation work, and I'm actually new to the world of archaeogaming. And Cece and Keri are newish to different degrees, have explored it more in depth in some areas, much more than I have, certainly. But we're, I think, new to it as well, and it's beyond the scope of our primary dissertation work. But we're very excited about it. I, for one, am really interested in starting to get into this world of archaeogaming and learning more about it. I've been a gamer for a long time, and obviously obsessed with both the past and how people talk about the past, and how we can both use games to better understand human activity, but also, how we can explore the past through gaming as well. So we're hosting a session today focused on trash in video games, and but not trash as video games, which Dr. Reinhardt briefly touched on in his presentation, his very extensive presentation on archaeogaming. One of the classic jokes about archaeologists, obviously, is that our career is in ruins. But to extend that joke, our work is often in trash. Things intentionally disposed of by humans, or accidentally dropped, or things that are destroyed and abandoned, they tend to make up the bulk of what we work with in different archaeological settings as well. So trash in video games is sort of a natural extension of some of these topics that we think about already in archaeology, and Dr. Reinhardt covered a great deal of that as well. So our conversation today is a preliminary sort of exploration of some of these issues. How the structure, or how we envision this structure working, is I am acting as our facilitator today. I'm the junior member of our little team here. Cece is now going to come up and provide some framework ideas about how we think about trash, how we can approach trash, some different categories of items that may be considered trash to different populations. And then Keri is going to provide us a deeper dive into a particular case study, specifically on the game Valheim. After we have those two presentations, I'm going to come back up and sort of facilitate some conversation that we might have, either some questions that I might have for Cece or Keri, but most importantly, any questions that you all have. And please feel free to have a wide-ranging approach to the topic of trash. Like I said, we're just sort of getting into these ideas ourselves. Really interesting from perspectives from all of you from different disciplines about how you may think about some of these ideas we're going to present. So anyway, yeah, let's just have fun and kind of explore some of these ideas together. I'll be looking in the chat too. I know Dan and some others are going to be helping out there too, but I'll be monitoring the Q&A chat too. So if you do have any questions there, you don't even have to type it all out if you'd like to ask it directly, as we did with our previous presentations and the questions. But if you'd prefer to type out the question there, feel free to put your question in the chat, and I can read that out and ask our presentation, or our presenters. So without further ado, I'm going to turn it over to Cece. Thanks.
All right, I'm there. I'm at the microphone. Give me a second to share my screen. I have learned that I need to have it open, not minimized, but I have to see this screen first. I'm working with one monitor here. All right. And I cannot see the chat or anyone in GatherTown right now, so I'm going to assume it is working fine unless someone gives me a shout.
Just give me confirmation. You're looking good.
Excellent. Thank you. So thank you, David, for the introduction. As he said, I'm Cece Chisdock, and this is going to be kind of our overview, our framework, what our thoughts are coming into this discussion of gaming garbology. So to start with the very basics, what is garbology? How is it tied to archaeology and archaeogaming? Simplest definition is the scientific study of trash, and it can encompass what people throw away, how and why they discard it, and from that, what information we can glean about their daily lives and broader social cultural contexts. It was first introduced to academic circles around 1971 by Professor William Rathje at the University of Arizona and his now famous Tucson Garbage Project. And now when garbology is referenced as a field, it typically refers to modern trash, but sorting through and making inferences from ancient trash is also a large part of what archaeologists do. When garbology mixes with archaeogaming, a lot of things may come to mind. So for example, the physical gaming garbage of the Atari video game burial that Dr. Reinhardt talked about. We want to focus on in-game garbage, which was mentioned very, very early on archaeogaming.com in an article aptly named Talking Trash in 2015. We want to similarly focus on trash at the level of objects, so kind of avoiding discussion of the abandonment of things larger like buildings or settlements. To organize this sort of preliminary discussion about in-game trash, I'd like to sort, for now, into two very broad categories. And this, of course, isn't all-encompassing, but it does give some structure to branch off from. So first is objects that the game, but maybe not the player, deems useless. And second is the larger category, objects that the player deems useless, which obviously can vary player to player. Objects the game itself deems useless can include duplicates of collectibles, event items, discontinued items, or quest items from quests that are completed, timed out, locked, or failed, or others. What's interesting to me about this type of trash is not how players discard it, which they may, but rather why and how players keep it. For example, in RuneScape, many quest items remain in your inventory after the quest completes, and many, if not all of them, are functionally useless and cannot be sold or dropped, only destroyed, at which point the object is gone from that player's account. Many players keep these items, often out of a desire to collect, to not lose items they can't gain back, or sentimentality. And people don't just keep useless items and unique items like this in video games. It's not just in the modern period in video games, it's throughout time. We keep some useless things that we think are neat. Another interesting RuneScape example is the case of burnt food, which is made from messing up in the cooking skill or cooking correctly and then cooking it again to specifically try to get burnt food. It's functionally useless in the game, but it has become a trend in the community to save burnt food and accumulate huge stacks of it, as stacks within the inventory can hold over 2 billion of each item. And you can see the large numbers on the image in the background here. This is just one person's collection of different burnt foods. As these impressive stack numbers, though, aren't visible to other players in the game, they must be shared as a screenshot, and this example of trash collecting speaks more to the larger community of the game and changing trends of gameplay, especially among veteran players. Now, the second category, which may have been your first thought when considering video game trash, are objects the player deems useless. This is with the caveat that the designation of useless may reflect more of a ranking of usefulness rather than total obsolescence in cases where the game limits carried or stored inventory. A large or heavy weapon may still be useful to a player, but not as useful as something lighter, which is more valuable, as you can see from this highlighted screenshot from Oblivion in a WikiHow article of how to drop items in Oblivion that recommends dropping low-value items that weigh the most. There are a few different mechanics by which a game may facilitate how players deal with their unwanted items, assuming that the items were picked up in the first place. Deconstruction, breaking down objects into their material components to reuse, also called recycling, depends on the game function. There's destruction, completely destroying an item, gaining no material or currency back. Selling or trading, though items deemed useless may only be sold for minuscule amounts and therefore may qualify more as trash than as an item with the purpose of selling. That's very dependent on the player and their method of playing the game, whether or not the player themselves deems it trash. There's also storing, perhaps for another disposal method later, or for possible future need that may never come, or as another way to manage trash by putting them in a container, which I have an example for in a minute. And then there's dropping, leaving it on the ground or a similar non-storage location in the world. Similar to the offline world, mechanics like deconstruction, destruction, selling, or trading can limit the amount of whole trash which ends up in the archaeological or the digital record at any given time. what proves especially interesting from an archaeological perspective is this storing and the dropping of trash. What dropping means is of course dependent on the particulars of the game. In some games, dropped items go into a void. They don't hit the ground, they're never seen again. It's essentially the same as destruction. In others, they may land on the ground and could stay there until the player changes locations or logs out after a predetermined amount of time, or sometimes only after a server reset. This despawning of items very rarely follows the timeline of how these items would vanish in the physical archaeological record. And importantly, a large part of the reason for dropped items despawning at all is that they take up a limited system resources and have limited use, as evidenced by being dropped in the first place. It's therefore the more persistent trash that could be of more interest to archaeologists, especially in how players may deal with large quantities of trash that takes a long time to despawn, which is what Keri will be discussing in part in the next presentation. So what do players do with their trash, with items that they deem useless? I'll give two quick examples. In very short-term persistence cases, only around 5 minutes, are ashes in RuneScape, which appear when a fire dies out. Players got creative with this short-term useless item and arranged fires to create an image, which once the fires turn to ash is visible on the minimap as dropped items appear there. It's interesting to note also the community rules around this type of drop art, that players generally avoid picking up the items on the ground. Sometimes drop art is even made from slightly more valuable items, and players still tend to not pick it up. It's considered rude. A less wholesome example is from Rust, where a player may encounter chests filled with valuable loot when out exploring. With a full inventory, players have two options if they want to pick up the loot. One, drop their more useless items on the ground, or two, swap their trash for the more valuable items in the chest. Most players choose the latter, putting their useless items in the chest, and at the same time taking out the valuable items. Most players choose that for two key reasons. One, taking the time to swap menus to drop items could get you killed. And two, leaving your trash behind and thus marking your presence can result in the same fate. This demonstrates a little bit of the importance of properly dealing with unwanted items, a bit like putting your garbage out of sight of bears while camping. To wrap up, I want to propose just a few possible routes of discussion when it comes to video game trash. First, in terms of the game itself, does management of unwanted items influence the gameplay? And if so, is this intentional or a consequence of other processes? What is the interplay between in-game trash and mechanics such as storage, collecting, and achievements, selling, building, despawn systems, or even the larger player community and changing trends in playstyles? And in terms of archaeology more broadly, and especially in worlds where garbage is persistent or in different forms, how do objects become trash? Who dubs them useless or garbage? Once the objects are considered trash, how are they discarded, stored, and/or recycled? And where do these objects ultimately end up and why? And what role does player choice and creativity have in managing useless items? And finally, how individual player choices of what is worth keeping and discarding may reflect various playstyles, and maybe far down the line, inform us about lifestyles in the non-virtual space. And one thing I forgot to address that I do want to quickly is that in games where items despawn rather quickly within 5 to 10 minutes, such as in RuneScape or Rust, there is the method of leaving items behind in a chest that are useless and taking the more valuable items. And I think that could serve as an interesting way to investigate trash and what people consider useless in games where items are not lasting in the permanent open world space, but rather in closed storage areas, although they do reset, but at a much longer time frame. And with all of that, I hope I've opened up the discussion a little bit, and then to go on right to Keri's great example of all of this stuff in Valheim. And I will stop sharing. And I will scooch off the stage. Go Keri.
And Keri, just confirm it. We can see your slides. You are looking good. You are on mute, though.
There we go. Apologies for that. I have a 17-year-old cat, and he's very grumpy, and he kind of just screams whenever he wants to, and there's nothing we can do about it. So if you hear screaming in the background, that is why, and I apologize in advance for it.
Well, thank you to your co-presenter.
So that was a wonderful breakdown by Cece, and I'm going to kind of dive into a really specific example of this. With Valheim and talking about virtual homesteads and kind of the accumulation of trash, because I think it's a really interesting example, kind of how trash can maybe unintentionally become a very large part of gameplay. So Valheim is a sandbox survival game that's placed in the 10th world off of the world tree. It was severed by Odin after it was filled with monsters, and you are a Viking who has been banished here, and your job is to fight your way to eventually reach Valhalla. It was developed by a indie first-time studio, Iron Gate Studios, and it's basically loosely based on Norse mythology. You're in a world filled of monsters. You're constantly battling, and it's turned out to be a really, really successful game. It's only in beta release currently, and it's one of the most successful early access games of all time, with currently selling 5 million copies. And it's going to be multi-platform. So currently it's only on PC, but in 10 days it will be released on Xbox, which is going to be really exciting to see how that develops as well. And I've actually been playing this since its release on February 2nd, 2021, off and on. So it's something that I have been engaging with as well. So homesteading is a really essential part of playing Valheim. You're in a procedurally generated world with different environments, and they all host different threats. And it's really important to make sure that you have a place to stay the night, because the night is dark and full of terrors. And you will ultimately not be able to survive very long early on if you don't have somewhere to sleep, at least at night. You're also later on in the game going to be subject to raids. The earth will shake, and you will have trolls or other types of monsters that will be randomly dropped into your homestead, and you will have to battle them until the earth stops shaking. So it can be quite a stressful time. I had last night was playing this game, and a troll was dropped into the middle of my homestead and killed all my domesticated pigs, which was very sad. So it's something that you have to prepare for, usually through the construction of these really well-built, sturdy homesteads. And the building system in the game for building these constructions works in a really specific way. You have a lot of multiple tools for building these things. You actually have to have a hammer to construct all of this. And furniture really falls specifically under a build system. And the build system works different than an item crafting system, where things can be constructed and deconstructed as you're building for your raw materials. So if you build a wall and you take your hammer and you deconstruct it, you will actually be given back that wood from the game, and you can use that to go and build another wall. So the raw material sourcing in this is really important to being able to construct these very large homesteads that are ultimately extremely complex. And you can kind of see one of these examples in a wintry landscape, which is a really harsh environment to construct in. And you actually have to have these really good settlements and really nice gear to be able to inhabit. So the tool, weapon, and armor crafting system works a little bit differently. You're going to do this on a workbench-based system, very common in most of these video games. And it's really interesting the way that you go through tools. It works on the age system. So you're going to start with stone tools. And after you have eventually defeated the first boss, you will have the option to now start mining for ore. And you'll move into the copper age, the bronze age, and then eventually the iron age. And this is also followed by silver and dark metal. And you're not just building weapons and armor at these tool benches. You're also building things that are essential for homesteading as well. You're building objects for butchering domesticated pigs after you've domesticated them. You're building objects that are essential for farming. So it's not just something that you're just constructing things that you're going to use to fight in the game. It's really essential to your ultimate survival, is kind of building these homesteads. And so I mentioned that it works on this age system. So The the extraction of raw ore is actually really, really complicated in the game. You have to have special tools to be able to extract raw ore. You have to have smelters to be able to melt them down. You need to have large quantities of charcoal to help in this process. And unfortunately, and to most players' ultimate frustration, you can't use quick transport portals if you have any type of metal ore in your inventory. So you have to make very long treks and set up almost camps for oring that you then have to transport back to your homestead, or you have to build multiple areas in which you can smelt this ore. But it ultimately leads to you having to transport these things across long distances, especially early game. And this became a really big problem for gamers because it's really hard to get all of these ores that you need to create your objects. And the crafted items that you create cannot be deconstructed for raw materials after you craft them. So basically, once you create your hoe, or you create a sword, or you create an axe, that axe cannot be deconstructed to have the wood back and the metal ore back or anything like that. So players pretty immediately noticed that this was going to be a problem in gaming. It's also an issue because it works on the same system as multiple games where you have limited slots in which you can put inventory items, and you also have a limited weight in which you can carry. So you don't have limitless space for all of these objects that you're creating that eventually become redundant and not useful as you are creating new and better objects in the game as you progress through these different ages. And this led to a lot of articles coming out pretty quickly right after the game was released on how to destroy items in Valheim, as people realized they were having an excess of items that they no longer needed. So we've got how to destroy items, we've got how to delete items, how to destroy items again. I really like this one, time to declutter the afterlife. And then how to trash junk items in Valheim. Why did I make 20 hoes in the first place? And so all of these articles kind of share the same thing, that there's only a certain amount of trash management systems within the game. The first option is chests. The second option is waiting for these items to despawn, and people have approached multiple different ways of doing this. And then there's now currently in game the obliterator, which I'll talk about in length later. And there's also built-in cheat codes. And so for today, I kind of want to focus on these chests and waiting for items to despawn, because these are things that were part of the original early release. And then I will focus on the obliterator, because this is something that came out with the Hearth and Home update, and actually is a really interesting concept of gamers kind of giving the players what they want. So chests work just like any other game. Chests are really great. They're one of the earliest objects that you can actually craft. They don't take a lot of special things to craft them. You only need a hammer, 10 wood, and a workbench, which are all pretty easy to get access as an early gamer. And you can store a limited amount of objects in them, and you can also create advanced versions of these that can store more objects. And they were really essential to a lot of players, as they found that they had a lot of objects that they were acquiring that they would need for crafting, and that they didn't really have place in their inventory to store them for long periods of time. And so you started getting really complex storage facilities. This is an example of one in the background that is far better than mine. This is an example of mine at my homestead in the game in the bottom right-hand corner. But people were creating lots of chests, stacking them up in different ways to create kind of storage facilities for managing the system of having a lot of raw materials that you needed to have for later on in the game. And I think there's a really great way to kind of tie this back into archaeology by using actually a 30-year-old archaeology on mobility and sedentism by Bob Kelly. But I think it's a great way to talk about how this kind of seamlessly, even though these games are occurring right now, they seamlessly work with archaeological theory from 30 years ago. And that's that the storage of stuff in the archaeological record, even where conditions for sedentism appear to exist, there's not always evidence that a storage of items is going to be sedentism, is something that Kelly is talking about. And this really plays out well in the game as well. Chests are one of the earliest objects that you can get. And so before you've even constructed your large and complex homesteads, you're creating chests to store your raw materials already out early on in the game, and to store these items that you may not find you need to be carrying around at all times within your inventory. And at the beginning of the game, you're also highly mobile. You may have small houses that you're staying in for the night, but many players are highly mobile as they're exploring this new landscape and trying to get a little grasp on where they're at. But then I would pose the question that if these items are being stored in chests, are they really trash? They're clearly being stored for a reason, whether that's sentimentality, as Cece kind of addressed, or whether it's raw materials that you plan to use later. Keeping it in a chest suggests that at some point you intend to open that chest again. You're going to visually see that thing again. And so what do you do with trash and objects that you no longer want to see? You want to have completely disappear entirely from the landscape. And this has been a really interesting problem for gamers. So this pure discarding of trash really relies on the despawn of items in the game. This can be highly variable depending on whether you're dropping items into water or whether you're leaving them in the middle of a forest and how close that's located to something that's been crafted, like a homestead or a workbench. And the shortest time that I've been able to find is 3 days. There was someone who stood around and watched an object for 3 days and it never despawned. So there's a little bit of a argument about how long things actually take to despawn and where. But one of the most foolproof methods people have put forward is actually loading up your ship. This is a long ship with all of your trash items, taking it out into the middle of the ocean and then hurling it for it to despawn when it hits the bottom of the ocean. Ships are actually something that you have to make later on in game. You need some more advanced crafting methods to be able to construct ships that can actually hold inventory. And so early on in game, people have kind of mimicked this system of dumping things in the ocean by just dumping them in the rivers. And this is a kind of fuzzy image up the top of someone just dumping things in the river, actually me last night dumping things in the river. And opposed to this idea of simply just dumping things in water, people have also been digging holes and throwing things within holes and then burying them up. So on the left here, you have a moat surrounding my homestead, which is actually our preferred method of trash, of getting rid of our trash, and we just hurl it into our moat, and it has never despawned. That's been there since we built this place. So definitely location to your homestead is going to heavily influence this. And then on the right here is another, people have been digging holes out in the middle of nowhere. Sometimes people build giant pits with a wall around them, and then they just hurl trash into it. And sometimes they'll also hurl monsters in there as well. So serving multi-purposes. And the Reddit page for this, for Valheim, really has a pretty hearty discussion base on what to do with your trash. Gamers are really talking about this a lot. And so I really like this idea of offering it up for fair skies and favorable winds on the sea by hurling it into the water. Or people just simply making dumps outside of their house who are, making an area designated for dumping their garbage and getting rid of it. They're not just leaving it on the ground outside. They're creating an area where they can kind of dispose of this trash. And this also plays into our kind of foundational example of the archaeological theory, and talking about how the distribution of trash and where trash is being placed can really be an indicator of sedentism. And so this concept of trash being swept off to the side is something that you're not going to necessarily do if you're staying in an area for long periods of time. You're forming special areas in which you are dumping your garbage. And so it's really relating more to this concept of space differentiation and how it's relating to trash. And that brings us to the Hearth and Home update. This came out in September 2022. And what was introduced in this game was the Obliterator. The Obliterator is this giant Thor-shaped hammer, which you can fill with objects that you no longer wish to have in your homestead or in your inventory. And if you fill it with enough items that are good enough, Thor will bestow a gift upon you. This gift is ultimately just coal. So all of the objects that you don't want that are being put into the Obliterator will become coal, and that's a resource that can be used in crafting. The problem is you need to have a Thunderstone to construct the Obliterator. The Thunderstone is something that can only be purchased from the merchant. And the merchant is a character in game who's randomly placed in a dark forest biome, which is very difficult to find early game. And you actually have to hunt for them for quite a long time to be able to find your merchant in some cases. And you also have to be able to have enough coin to be able to buy the Thunderstone, which is something that isn't available to early gamers as well. This only came as within an expansion. So it's wondering if this is evidence of the issue, if they're actually saw that gamers had issues with their trash and they tried to solve it by giving them the obliterator. But the problem is that it's only reducing objects to coal. And coal is not a difficult resource to get in the game. It's quite numerous. The creating the kiln to actually melt down the wood into coal is very simple early on. And so it really kind of represents that, like, this is not exactly what gamers wanted, but it's what they got. And so I'm wondering if that also can reflect on how the game developers see this issue of not being able to deconstruct objects and not being able to get raw materials in the game as something that they're adding into as like a challenge within the game. It's intentionally put there, which again has created this interesting dynamic and how players deal with that. So now to talk about kind of our takeaways for archaeology, and going back to this Kelly example again, is that people don't strictly live in sedentary systems and they don't strictly live in mobile systems. They have different levels of each. And so thinking about the location of trash is a really important component of both sedentism and mobility. And this is going to replicate itself in the real and in the digital worlds, because the worlds in games are not entirely unlike our own. We are also both mobile and sedentary. In the game, even after you've constructed these large-scale homesteads, you are still moving throughout the landscape, and you're still going to different areas to exploit different resources. And so there's still a level of mobility, even if you have constructed your homestead. And then also thinking about these games as forms of digital ethnoarchaeology. If you removed gamers and you removed everything from the game that's kind of giving us this narrative of why people are doing the ways they do things, and you simply place in an unfamiliar archaeologist into the scenario, they could make up a interpretation of what they were seeing in the landscape. And they may be able to make up interpretations about what sedentism looks like in this specific world, what mobility looks like in this specific world, and how these can kind of be looked at as indicators in the real world and the archaeological record that we see today. And so I think Valheim is a really interesting case study for this. And I think it's a great space for future studies in space differentiation and the use of landscapes, as was previously mentioned by Dr. Reinhardt. So I want to thank everyone, the Osmondius Project and Digital Hammurabi, for inviting us to this conference, and especially thank everyone in organizing it. And if you have any questions on this presentation, you're more than welcome to email me, or if you would like a copy, please just feel free to reach out.
Sorry, everybody. I was having a bit of lag there, so I kept overshooting the stage by quite a bit every time I tried to come back up to the microphone. But I think I finally found it again, too. So thanks, Keri and Cece, for, if I do say so myself, the really interesting and informative presentation as well. So I'm here to facilitate some conversation and questions on these topics. I see that Dr. Reinhardt has put some questions in the chat there and some observations. I don't know if, Dr. Reinhardt, if you'd like to come up to the microphone and ask them, or if you'd like me to read them out. I'm happy to do either one. Looks like the avatar is approaching.
You can read them out.
I love that. Thank you very much. So, Dr. Reinhardt says, I'm new to Valheim, PS user. One, are the homesteading landscapes procedurally generated, new every time? And I'll read them through and then we can take them one by one too. And then two, does the game have a map feature where you can see settlements surrounding? Three, is there a co-op mode where human settlers can interact? And then the conclusion there is, I'm curious to see if we could map trash middens in relation to settlements and where players choose to site their homesteads in the landscape. fascinating stuff, which I definitely agree. So let's take the first up there too, and I'll let Keri speak, and I can chat into as a Valheim user myself. I just joined Keri in their world yesterday and built my satellite homestead near their much more impressive living space. But anyway, so Keri, so our homesteading landscapes procedurally generated, i.e. new every time.
Hold on. Am I talking now?
Yeah.
Fantastic. Yeah, so they are procedurally generated every time. They're going to have a different distribution of those biomes. They've got like mountain biomes and grassland biomes and forest biomes, and it's going to randomly generate that map. There is a map feature, and it's a really kind of nice map feature. You can put different landmarks on it. So if you stumble upon like an abandoned house, which actually exists pretty frequently in the game, these kind of like abandoned, ruined, it almost suggests that there were previous homesteads, which is something that they don't dive too deep to in like the lore of the game. But you can stumble across those and mark those out. You could create them as your own homestead. And as you map out your landscape, it's going to reveal, as you explore, it's going to reveal new things on your map. So your map comes to you completely blacked out, and you have to really explore this world, and it's pretty expansive. We have maybe 25 to 30% of our landscape explored, but I'm also a PhD student, and my partner has a full-time job, and so neither of us can like full-time explore Valheim. Yeah, there is a co-op mode. The co-op mode can go up to 10 players who can be in your world at one time. And how this works really interesting with the game is there's actually a cartography table for those maps. So once one player has explored the landscape, they can go and report it at your cartography table. And then other players who come into your world can go and explore at your cartography table, and they can get a copy of your map, which occurred yesterday with David. So my partner and I had explored a decent percentage of our landscape. He came into our world for the first time, and so he immediately went to the cartography table to get a little idea of like where he was going. Even though we homesteaded pretty close to the main altar for the game, where you're going to, after you defeat bosses, you bring back trophies to the altar. And we decided to place our homestead there, one, because it's in the grasslands, which is the least dangerous of the biomes, and two, because it's very close to this place that we were going to be going back to over and over in game. And that's kind of a thing that players have chosen their homesteads for different reasons. Where they place them within the landscape can depend on, if you're in a mountain biome, it might be that you're trying to limit people coming into your homestead if you have a bunch of gamers in there, or you're trying to create something that looks really impressive. Some people are mostly just trying to build something that's really defensible. So we dug a giant moat around ours to try to defend from these kind of unfriendly monsters, which didn't work as my pigs were all killed yesterday. And some people are doing this located usually close to the water. And this has to do with that ability to not be able to transport ore through these gates. You have to use ships to transport things at long distances. And so people are usually doing this at the water because ore is extremely heavy. And unless you've built a cart to be able to lug that back and forth from your ship to your homestead, you want to make sure that that location is pretty close to water. So you have access to kind of, our homestead is in a harbor. So we have kind of like a little bay area where we've constructed a dock and a harbor, and it was an essential part. But most people are doing this after they've explored the landscape to some degree. So you're really starting out pretty mobile from the beginning, and then you're kind of designating where you would start this like long-term homestead. And this changes as people explore new biomes. They might move their homestead later on. But people tend to have one primary, maybe two primary homesteads, because a lot of these objects are quite intensive to construct. And once you've built, our homestead has been many, many man hours. And so once you've built that, you tend to not want to abandon it.
Yeah, and I could just hop on there too, because I had some kind of thoughts coming out of that as well. But yeah, so just to clarify too, so you're dropped into the world without, I think you basically arrive naked and you have to move up from there. On the procedurally generated landscape, as Keri mentioned, there are some fake ruins, essentially. These haven't been created by player actions. They're derelict buildings that exist on the surface. You can usually find some resources there that the game, like if you go into some one of the ruined houses, you can find a chest that may have some money in it or some resources as well. But to Dr. Reinhardt's point, it would actually be really interesting to take a multiplayer co-op map and have those 10 different players or whatever exist through or progress through the game, building as they go. Because as Keri says, while you tend to have one or two larger bases that you develop over time, because they tend to be really resource intensive. If you remember some of the pictures that Keri showed during their presentation, right, there's a giant moat, you have a palisade wall, you have a lot of storage of items that you do want to keep, not trash. But outside of that main base, you also have potentially like mining camps, logging camps, shelters near different biomes, so that if you die in those biomes, you can respawn close by. As Dr. Reinhardt mentioned, it would be interesting to take like a multiplayer example and have archaeologists come in after the players have gone through the game progression and look at the landscape and the pattern of both settlement and potentially how people have disposed of their trash. I was thinking of one example in Valheim specifically regarding industrial production that Keri mentioned too. So you have to go mine copper, especially early games that I've been involved in too, which exist in these resource deposits out in the Black Forest biome. And it occurs to me, so right when we're on an actual archaeological site in the non-digital world, one of the, we find a lot of, if we're looking at a site where industrial production is taking place, we can find things like metal slag, wasters, so discarded, broken pieces of things, etc. And thinking about this in the context of Valheim, I think you could identify a copper mining site, at least in my experience, right? So not only are you producing lots of amount of stone, which you don't have particular use for, it's extremely heavy. So I just kind of throw it into the forest while I'm mining, or you can place it in stone piles. But there's also enemies that are going to attack you and drop things like resin, which is another thing that comes up a lot in the game, which is very useful, but you tend to have an abundance of it early on. So if you had visited one of my copper sites, not only will you find stone piles and stones scattered around, but you're going to see the landscape littered with resin and wood and other things that the enemies may drop that I'm just not picking up because I'm focusing on the copper. So you can actually identify industrial sites, industrial working sites in Valheim through some of the trash that is left out in these purpose-built sites. So you can actually identify specific use cases as well. So that was one of the things I wanted to say. I know we have some stuff going on in the chat here, so let's see. So Megan asked a question here. Do you want to go ahead and ask it, or yeah, I'll turn over the mic to Megan, and then I think Keri had a response here as well.
And hey, Megan, I see you're trying to talk, but you are on mute.
All right, I have a screaming toddler in the background.
You're good
so
now.
I just muted myself. Completely. This is really interesting, and I was wondering if the panel knew of any other instances where game designers and developers respond in this kind of way to players' use or non-use of trash items. I know I used to play Guild Wars an awful lot, and there was this flower that was considered a trash item but could be used in a quest, and they kind of, players used to keep them in their inventories for a really extended period of time, way past when they could actually use them, and then that flower pops up again in Guild Wars 2, which always really interested me as a player. So I was just wondering if this was something that you guys had run into before.
Oh, sorry, navigating the mic there. And yeah, absolutely. But I wanted to go back to David's point of him throwing away the stone. We're constructing a castle at our homestead right now, and stone is unbelievably valuable, which plays into this idea of like one man's trash, another man's treasure, because we would never throw away stone at this point in our adventure. But yeah, so players responding to trash, this is kind of an odd example, but I think it's a pretty decent one of the Sims. So if anyone's been playing The Sims, I've been playing The Sims for, 20 years. The original game, there was a lot of trash. It was a component of like cleaning up trash and like moving trash into trash cans, and there was a lot of things going on with that. And in iterations of the game, they started making it where you could actually sort through trash and you could dig through trash to find objects because people didn't love the idea of just like this easy task. And so now there's actually in the Sims, you can go dumpster diving. So you can jump into the dumpsters and find usable objects, and it's usually like an old battered couch or something like that. So really making just this kind of useless form of trash something that's really like a large component of the game later on in their later iterations. And I'm curious actually to see what they're going to do with kind of this trash system. They're currently developing The Sims 5. So it's going to be interesting to see what they do with that if they don't make it where like every item in the game you have to pay $50 to get or something like that, because that seems to be what EA is doing. And then just thinking of like another example of that, in The Witcher 3, there was a lot of people who got really, really frustrated when just the labeling of a trash item. So when you meet Yennefer and Skellige, for anyone who is familiar with that storyline, you get a key to her room, and the key was labeled a common item that you could sell to a merchant. And gamers got really infuriated with that, that it was a common item, and they thought that it spoke to the relationship between you and that character. And so they actually, in an update, changed it to be a relic object so that it's no longer common and a trash item, because it kind of infuriated gamers relating back to that lore of Geralt and Yennefer's kind of, long time relationship. So it's kind of influencing something from being trash to no longer being trash, just because of how gamers reacted to it.
Yeah, so I have two examples too for your question, Megan, and one is not the developers responding, but the players creating add-ons to make trash management a little bit easier. So I don't play World of Warcraft, but this is something that came up in the course of my research on video games, as I call it, and not a hobby. It's work now. But there are items that are poor quality. They're called grays or vendor trash, where they can be sold for money, but a very small amount, to where they're only really valuable to newer players, players that haven't been playing for 10, 15 years. And there is actually at least one add-on that I know about that players have made for the game that allows you to bulk sell those items all at once. All of your gray quality vendor trash items, they allow you to sell that in one go. And one that I know of developers responding not by doing anything particular with the trash, but in the example of RuneScape that I had of these items that aren't trash to the players because they want to keep them, but they are trash according to the developers because they no longer have a use. RuneScape has added some jokes about players doing that, about like, you still have this item, or if you try to use one of those items that are no longer useful from an event or a quest you have completed, it could pop up a dialogue that makes a joke about you trying to use this item that has lost its purpose. So I don't know of any other examples of them trying to fix trash, like with the obliterator, but those are two that I know of where they're dealing with the trash in some way.
Thanks, and I'll just jump back on. Again, if anyone in the audience has any questions, feel free to step up, ask them in the chat, or just run up to the microphone and shove my little avatar away. But in the meantime, one of the things that came out of listening to the presentations and thinking about them too, that we didn't particularly touch on is trade, and how trade may impact what is considered trash or how trash is disposed of. I think we could even continue with our Valheim example that Keri and I were discussing, where stone was not very useful to me at the time because I was only building in wood, and stone is less useful before you start constructing in stone. Whereas that changes dramatically once you do start constructing in stone. So if there had been a trade system, obviously what was trash to me might be very valuable. Thinking of RimWorld, another excellent game that we didn't touch on in our conversations, but a lot of my colony, which you, again, build a colony on a planet, very similar in a lot of ways, build a colony on a planet, produce goods, consume resources, but you do have traders come in. And so in that sense, also, I'm producing things for market or producing things that traders may have or may be needed, which isn't useful in my colony. So just, again, a topic that we can think through about what is trash, what isn't trash. But it would be interesting to bring in that trade element as well, which is also something that actually does relate to my primary dissertation research. And the other thing that's related to that too is what I've chosen to call hopeful trash in my hour and a half of thinking about it, which is items that are currently trash to me, currently completely useless, but I anticipate will have some sort of future need. Stone is a great example of what we were just talking about. Money in Valheim that Keri was pointing out. Before I found the trader, which again is not very obvious in Valheim. You may collect coins, and if you kill trolls, you collect coins. They're coinage. They're described as gold and coins. So I assume they have some use, but there is no obvious use in the game for them at that point. So I started hoarding them like a little dragon in my homestead, assuming that there is going to be some future use. And there's a couple of items in the game, like thistles that you may find in the forest. If the game lets me pick it up and take it back, I'm assuming that there's going to be some use for it in the future. So while it's kind of trash in the meantime, because I have no clue what it's used for, I do collect it and store it and things like that. So those two kind of items of like hopeful trash and trade and what is trash would be, I think, productive ways to continue thinking through some of these topics. Before I see Megan has their hand up again. Before I turn it over, though, I wondered, if Keri or Cece had any thoughts on those items. If not, I will turn it over to Megan. Okay, perfect. Megan, what is your question? No problem. I guess that's one of the side effects of the digital section here. But the equivalent of that would you have been standing in a hotel ballroom not noticing that your arm had been up for a while. So let's see. So a couple other things that I thought of coming out of that. One of the things, right, is an archaeologist was preservation. So what gets preserved in the archaeological record in the material world, in the physical world that we're in, varies quite a lot, but it tends to be very limited, right? In most instances, you're having the preservation of what we would consider very durable goods, right? Like metal, glass, particularly interesting for me, coinage, the osteological records, so people's bones often preserved for periods of time, though not indefinitely. And then we can find environments where we get much greater preservation. We can find textiles in either particularly arid or particularly wet areas, et cetera. So I was thinking about, it's interesting in games what gets preserved in different ways and how the quality of preservation, because at least in Valheim, as we've been talking about, all of these crafted items, whether they're a thistle that I picked up, a piece of cooked boar meat that'll stay it stays forever essentially, or it stays to the duration that any other good. So there's a different sort of preservation level that's happening in these areas. So I was wondering if Cece and Keri had any thoughts about how the differences in preservation conditions in the digital world versus the real world may impact our consideration of trash in video games.
I do for sure, because in the course of trying to find some examples for my big overview, I did come across a game that I was not familiar with at all called Medieval Dynasty. And one thing that came up in searching for the term trash in the subreddit is that the despawn rates in that game for food and any other object are different. So they have like perishable items that despawn at a quicker rate than something like wood logs, which may despawn seasonally, which I thought was very interesting. And I will be diving much deeper into that game. But there is at least one example of a kind of differential preservation. And it is so different from real life because I mentioned just in one quick sentence, it has to be a choice for things not to despawn because it does take up a lot of the either computer or console or server resources to keep them on the ground. So yeah, it's an extra consideration because the planet that we're living on is not thinking like, wow, this is a lot of stuff. This is really using up a lot of my energy. But yeah, Keri, if you have.
Yeah, absolutely. So thinking about just the despawn rates, what we're looking at in archaeology when you're looking in a trash midden is not what you're going to get for long periods of time in a game where there's despawn rates. You can't go back to those things after, months and months and see what people threw away. It's kind of a be there in the moment kind of thing. So you're getting a different kind of viewpoint, but also that despawn rates, as Cece's touched on and as Dr. Reinhardt touched on, that these things don't exist in nowhere. Games are housed on servers and they do have a climate impact. And so the more objects that you have in these games, that's a huge part of Valheim itself, is that, you have just endless amounts of objects, endless amounts of things that are being generated. It actually does have more of an effect than people think that it does.
Yeah, and this is also why I really like, I don't like Rust as a game, which is not an issue of the game itself. It is an issue of some of the people you may encounter when playing a large public server. But I really like Rust as an example of those chests and putting your trash in those chests when you are out exploring, because it's different from putting it in the chests that that are in your house. That it's sort of like I might use this later sort of thing. You're leaving it and abandoning it. And the reason that I like these chests as a storage method for throwing away your garbage is that in a lot of games, storage containers like that have a much longer time before they reset or despawn. So we can get a somewhat longer record from that, and more of a stretch than a garbage pit, but from that interpret what people are deeming useless.
Absolutely. Thanks very much. So we're somehow this time has actually flown by extremely quickly. So we're wrapping up here, but I just want to thank everyone for their time and attention and their thoughtful questions, and for listening to us as we continue to begin the process of engaging with some of these ideas. So I will put my email in the chat as well after I step off. If anyone's interested in continuing these conversations offline, as Keri put their contact information as well, and Cece, you can also find us on the Notre Dame website as well. But anyway, again, thanks very much to the organizers and for the attendees, and enjoy the rest of the conference.
And thank you once again to our round of presenters there. That was a really great panel. Really love the audience engagement here too. So thank you all for coming here. We're going to be starting our lunch break in just a few minutes. Gathertown will still be open. Please use this time to go ahead, look at the exhibition hall. You can maybe walk up and talk to some people who just presented if you have maybe some more one-on-one questions you want to ask. And you can check out the maze, the games, or you can also go back into the real world, get a snack to eat, use the bathroom if you need. And as always, if you have any questions, just find somebody in an orange shirt with the HPH name and we'll be happy to help you out. Our next presentation is going to be in about 1 hour at 1 p.m. Central Time. And that's going to be the Odyssey in AC Odyssey, a playthrough with Lexi and Megan. So that'll be here in about an hour at 1 p.m. But until then, we are kind of on a lunch break. There's no planned programming. So feel free to walk around and enjoy the space.